She leaned across my dead wife's casket and told me I would be forgotten by Christmas. Nobody in that funeral home moved. The organist's hand froze mid-chord, one note hanging in the cold air of the chapel like it didn't know where to land. My son stood beside her and he smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a grieving man's smile, a satisfied one, the kind men wear when they think they've already won something. I was 70 years old, standing over the woman I had loved for 43 years, and my own daughter-in-law had just told me, in a whisper meant only for my ear, that I was already being erased. I felt like an old fence post left standing in a field, long after the fence itself has been torn down and hauled away, useless, forgotten, waiting for someone to finally get around to pulling me out of the ground. My name is Walter Hensley. I am a stonemason. For 42 years I built things that were meant to outlast me, fireplaces that would warm grandchildren I would never meet, garden walls that would still be standing after the houses behind them had been torn down and rebuilt twice over, foundations poured so deep and so square that engineers half my age would tap them with a level and shake their heads in something close to reverence. I worked with my hands. I worked with stone because stone does not lie to you. Wood rots. Metal rusts. People change their stories, but a stone wall built true will still be true 100 years from now, long after everyone who remembers building it is gone. I believed, foolishly, that if I built my family the same way, patient, honest, load-bearing, it would hold the same way stone holds. I was wrong about that. And 3 weeks before that funeral home whisper, I found out exactly how wrong. My wife's name was Margaret. Everyone who loved her called her Maggie. She died on a Tuesday morning in March, in the bedroom of the house I had built for her, with my own 2 hands back, when we were young enough to believe our backs would never give out. I was holding her hand when she went. Her fingers were thin by then, the skin loose over knuckles that used to hold a paintbrush for hours at a time without complaint, and in the last conscious moment she had, she looked at me and she said, "Trust the box, Walter. Whatever they tell you, whatever it looks like, trust the box." I did not know what box she meant. I thought it was the medication talking, or the fever, or simply a dying woman's mind, reaching for something to hold on to in the dark. I kissed her forehead and told her I loved her, and I did not ask her to explain, because you do not interrogate a woman in her final minutes. You just hold her hand and let her go gently. I have regretted that silence every day since, not because I think I could have gotten an answer, but because I wanted one more sentence from her, any sentence, even a confusing one. Maggie came from money, real money, old money, the kind that does not announce itself with a big house or a loud car. Her family had owned quarry land in 3 counties going back 4 generations, granite mostly, the good, dense kind that cathedral builders used to send agents out to buy by the ton. Her grandfather had sold off pieces of it over the decades, but he had kept the crown of it, 1,100 acres wrapped around a lake, so clean you could see your own boots on the bottom in August. Land that had never once in 110 years been logged, mined, or subdivided. When Maggie's mother passed, that land came to Maggie, and when Maggie married a stonemason's apprentice with grease under his fingernails and a truck that needed a new transmission, her family was not exactly throwing a parade about it. But Maggie did not care what her family thought. She loved me, and she loved, more than anything else on this earth besides me, that piece of land, because it was the one place where her grandfather used to take her as a girl and teach her the names of rocks, the way other grandfathers teach their grandchildren the names of birds. We lived simply. That was not an accident, and it was not poverty. It was a choice, one we made together in the first year of our marriage. Sitting at a kitchen table in an apartment above a hardware store, Maggie said she did not want our children growing up soft, did not want them to think the world owed them anything just because their mother's name was on a deed somewhere. So I kept working stone, and she kept teaching art at the local elementary school for a salary that would not have covered the property taxes on that lake land alone. And our son, Derek, grew up thinking his father was a tradesman and his mother was a school teacher, which was true as far as it went. What he did not grow up knowing was the rest of it. And that omission, that one small mercy Maggie and I extended to him in the name of raising a grounded, humble boy, turned out to be the crack in the foundation that everything else eventually poured through. I need to tell you about the first time I saw what my son was capable of, because it happened a long time before any of this, and because Maggie saw it too, and because what she did about it quietly, patiently, over the next 20 years, is the entire reason I am standing here today with a story worth telling instead of a story that ends with me in a state facility, somewhere, forgotten, exactly the way my daughter-in-law promised I would be. Derek was 19. It was the Sunday after Thanksgiving, and our church was collecting money for a family whose house had burned down 2 towns over. A mother, a father, 4 kids, everything gone. Insurance lapsed because the father had been laid off from the paper mill 3 months earlier and had let it slide, trying to keep food on the table instead. The collection box sat on a folding table in the fellowship hall, an old cigar box really, wrapped in construction paper by the Sunday school kids, stuffed with cash and checks people had brought from home specifically for that family. I walked into the hall to get my coat, and I saw my son standing alone at that table. He did not see me. I watched him slide 4 $20 bills out of that box and fold them into his jacket pocket, smooth as anything, like he had done it 100 times before. Then he closed the lid and walked away whistling. I did not say anything to him that day. I told myself it was a moment of weakness, a young man short on cash before a date, something he would regret and never repeat. I told myself a lot of things that day that let me avoid a hard conversation, and I have thought about that folding table more times in the years since than I care to admit. But I did tell Maggie. That night, in bed, in the dark, I told her what I had seen, and I remember she did not say a single word for almost a full minute. Then she said, very quietly, "He's not going to grow out of that, Walter. Boys who steal from burned-out families at 19 don't grow into men who give things away." I told her she was being too hard on him, that everyone makes a bad choice once, and she let it go, out loud. But I found out much later that she never actually let it go inside herself. That night was the night, as best I can figure, that my wife began quietly building the thing that would take her 20 years to finish. I am not going to pretend the next 2 decades were some slow, visible slide into villainy, because that is not how it happened, and I do not want to tell you a story that is neater than the truth. Derek grew up. He went to a good university on a partial scholarship, and the rest paid for out of savings we had scraped together, stone by stone, no pun intended. He got a business degree, went to work for a regional bank doing commercial lending, worked his way up over 12 years to a title that had the word vice president in it, married a sharp, pretty, ambitious woman named Vanessa who worked in luxury real estate, bought a house in a development with a name like a golf resort, even though there was no golf course anywhere near it, and had 1 daughter, our granddaughter Lily, who at 12 years old is, and I say this with the grandfather's full bias and also with complete honesty, the only unbroken, uncomplicated joy that family has ever produced. For most of those 12 years, Derek was, on the surface, a good son. He called on Sundays. He came for Thanksgiving. He brought Lily out to the workshop and let me teach her how to hold a chisel properly, how to read the grain of a stone before you strike it. And there was a period, Lily was maybe 7 or 8, where I let myself believe the folding table had just been one bad afternoon after all. A 19-year-old stupid mistake, nothing more. Maggie never fully believed that. She loved our son with the whole of her heart, the way mothers do regardless of evidence. But she watched him the way you watch a wall you built years ago that has a hairline crack running up through the mortar. It might be nothing. It might just be settling, or it might be the first sign that something underneath is shifting in a way you cannot see from the surface. The crack widened when Derek married Vanessa. I want to be careful here, because I do not believe a person is purely good or purely bad, and I do not believe Vanessa walked into our family as some kind of villain in a stage play, twirling a mustache she did not have. What I believe, having watched it play out over 8 years, is that Vanessa saw in Derek a particular kind of hunger that was already there, waiting, really, for someone to give it permission, and she gave it permission with both hands. She was raised, from what I understand, by a single mother who worked 3 jobs and never once owned a home, And Vanessa had built her entire adult identity around the idea that she would never, ever be poor again. That comfort was not a luxury, but a moral necessity she had earned through sheer force of will. There is nothing wrong with wanting security. I wanted it too, once, badly enough to spend 42 years laying stone in the summer heat and the winter cold to make sure my family had it. But there is a difference between wanting security and being willing to take it from someone else's hands. And somewhere along the way, in a marriage I watched from the outside, with the specific helplessness of a father who knows he cannot unring a bell, Vanessa and Derek stopped being able to tell the difference. The reason I am telling you all of this before I tell you about the will reading, before I tell you about the box, is that Maggie needed all 20 of those years. She was not a woman who acted on a single afternoon of anger over a cigar box full of Thanksgiving money. She was patient, the way stone is patient. She watched. She kept records I did not know she was keeping. She made one phone call a year, sometimes two, to a trust attorney 200 miles from our town, a woman named Charlotte Reyes, who Maggie had actually gone to college with decades earlier, and who agreed, out of old friendship and later out of professional conviction, to help my wife build something so quiet and so careful that not even I, her husband, of 43 years, fully understood what it was, until the day it all came apart in front of everyone we knew. I have my own confession to make here, and I want to make it now, early, before the rest of this story, because I do not want you thinking I am some blameless old man, standing at the center of his own righteousness. I knew, on some level, that something was wrong in that marriage. I saw the way Vanessa's eyes moved across our living room whenever she visited, cataloging, pricing, the way she once asked, almost offhand, over Christmas dinner, whether the lake property had ever been appraised. I saw Derek go quiet in ways he never used to go quiet. The particular silence of a man who has learned it is easier to let his wife speak for him than to argue with her. And I said nothing. For years I said nothing, because I told myself it was not my place, because I told myself confrontation would only push my son further away, because I was, if I am honest with myself in the way a man has to be honest with himself, once he is standing at his wife's grave, a coward about the one conversation that might actually have mattered. I do not know if speaking up earlier would have changed anything. Some men cannot be reached, no matter how early you reach for them. But I never gave myself the chance to find out, and that is a stone I still carry. Maggie was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 14 months before she died. She told Derek and Vanessa almost immediately she was not a woman who hid hard truths from her family. Whatever else she may have hidden, and I watched something shift in both of them within days of that diagnosis, something I could not name at the time, but understand with perfect, sickening clarity now. Grief, in a healthy family, looks like casseroles left on the porch and phone calls that go too long, and grown children suddenly remembering to say, "I love you," before hanging up. What I watched happen in my son and daughter-in-law over those 14 months looked like something else entirely. It looked like calculation wearing grief's clothing. It started small. Vanessa began coming to more doctor's appointments than made sense for a daughter-in-law, always with a legal pad, always asking the oncologist very specific questions about prognosis and timeline that had nothing to do with treatment and everything to do with scheduling. Derek started bringing up, gently at first, the subject of getting things in order, which sounded reasonable enough on its face. Every family should have their affairs organized, except that the conversations always circled back, with a persistence that eventually stopped feeling accidental, to the lake property specifically. What was it worth, whether it had ever been formally appraised, whether Maggie had ever considered what would happen to it if something happened to both of us at once? I remember one dinner, maybe 5 months before Maggie died, when Vanessa suggested, in a tone so light and reasonable it took me a full 10 seconds to understand what she had actually said, that it might be wise for Maggie to simply transfer the lake property into Derek's name now, while she was, in Vanessa's words, still lucid enough to make good decisions, so the family wouldn't have to deal with probate headaches later. Maggie set down her fork. She looked at Vanessa for a long moment, long enough that Lily, who was 10 at the time, stopped eating, and looked between the adults with the particular alertness children have for tension they cannot name but can absolutely feel. And then Maggie smiled. I remember that smile, because it was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a woman closing a book she has already finished reading, and she said, "That's very thoughtful of you, Vanessa. I'll have my attorney look into it." She never did. What she actually did, I would not learn until 3 weeks after her funeral, sitting in a leather chair in Charlotte Reyes's office, with my hands shaking around a cup of coffee I never drank, was call Charlotte the very next morning and add 17 new pages to a document she had already been quietly building for the better part of 2 decades. Maggie's decline, once it truly started, moved fast in the way pancreatic cancer moves fast, which is to say, slowly enough to be cruel and quickly enough to steal your breath when you look back on it. She spent her last 3 months in our bedroom, in the bed we had shared for 4 decades, and to their credit, and I want to be fair here, because fairness matters even when I am furious, maybe especially then, Derek visited often during those final weeks. He sat with her. He held her hand. I do not believe even now that my son is a man entirely without love for his mother. I believe he is a man who found a way to hold love in one hand and hunger in the other without ever quite letting the two touch, which is its own particular kind of tragedy, maybe sadder in some ways than simple cruelty would have been. Vanessa visited less. When she did visit, I noticed, and I hate that I noticed, I hate that grief taught me to watch my own family, like a man watching for a structural crack, that her eyes went to the jewelry box on Maggie's dresser, to the paintings on the wall, to the framed deed of survey that had hung in our hallway since before Derek was born, more often than they went to Maggie's face. 2 weeks before she died, on an afternoon when Derek and Vanessa had driven up together, and Lily was at school, Vanessa asked to speak with me alone in the kitchen while Derek sat with his mother. She made me a cup of tea I did not ask for, and she sat across from me at the same table where Maggie and I had once decided, 40 years earlier, to raise our son without the shadow of money hanging over him. And she told me, in the gentlest, most caring voice I had ever heard her use, that she and Derek had been talking, and that they thought, once this was over, once Maggie had passed, once the dust settled, it might be time for me to think seriously about somewhere smaller. Somewhere with people around. Somewhere I wouldn't have to keep up a big house and 1,100 acres of lake property all alone at 70 years old with a bad hip and, as she put it, everything else going on. She said it like a kindness. She said it while patting my hand. And underneath the kindness, so far underneath that I do not think even she fully knew it was there, I could hear the actual sentence, the one she never said out loud. "Get out of the way now, old man. Before you become an obstacle we have to remove later." I did not argue with her that afternoon. I want to be honest about why. It was not strategy. I was not yet the man who would later sit calmly through a will reading with a chessboard already arranged in my head. I did not argue because I was exhausted in a way I had never been exhausted in my life, hollowed out by watching my wife disappear one day at a time, and I did not have anything left in me to spend on my daughter-in-law's plans for my future. I simply nodded, and said I would think about it, and went back upstairs to sit with Maggie for the last real conversation we would ever have, the one where she told me, with her voice already thinning to something like paper, that whatever happened after she was gone, whatever anyone told me, whatever it looked like, trust the box. Maggie died 4 days later, on a Tuesday morning, with my hand in hers and the March light coming pale and gray through the bedroom curtains. I will not pretend to you that I handled her death with any grace at all in the first days after. I did not eat properly. I did not sleep more than 2 or 3 hours a night. I sat in the workshop for hours at a time, not working, just sitting, running my thumb over a piece of unfinished granite the way I used to run my thumb over her wedding ring when I was deciding, at 24 years old, and terrified whether I had the nerve to ask her father for his blessing. Derek handled the funeral arrangements, which I appreciated at the time and still appreciate now, whatever else has happened since. There is a version of my son who is capable of stepping up, and grief, for a little while, brought that version forward. Vanessa handled the guest list, the caterer, the flowers, all of it efficient and correct and entirely without warmth, like a woman managing a corporate event rather than burying her husband's mother. The funeral was on a Saturday, 11 days after Maggie died. 300 people came, former students from her 31 years teaching art, cousins from 4 states, old friends from the church where a 19-year-old boy had once emptied a collection box meant for a family who had lost everything. I stood at the front of that chapel in a suit I had not worn since my own father's funeral, and I looked down at my wife's face, powdered and still, and not quite hers anymore, the way a face never is once the person is gone from behind it, and I felt Vanessa's hand on my elbow, steering me, guiding me toward the casket for one last moment before the service began, and that is when she leaned in close, her lips almost against my ear, her voice pitched so low that no one 3 feet away could have heard a single word of it, and told me that I would be forgotten by Christmas, that the house was too much for one old man alone, that Derek had already spoken to someone about options, that it would be so much easier for everyone if I simply understood that now. Before things got complicated, I did not cry out. I did not create a scene at my own wife's funeral, though God knows a part of me wanted to. I straightened my back the way you straighten a wall before you set the level against it, and I looked past Vanessa's shoulder to where my son stood 3 feet away, close enough that he must have heard at least the shape of what his wife had just said to me over his mother's open casket, and Derek smiled. It was small. It was quick. Anyone else in that chapel would have missed it entirely, would have read it as a grieving son's reflexive, uncomfortable half-smile at a moment, too painful to hold on his face directly. I did not misread it. I'd watched that boy's face for 52 years. I knew every version of his smile the way I know the grain of a stone I have worked for a full season, and this was not grief's smile. This was the smile of a man who believes, with total and comfortable certainty, that the hard part is already over. I buried my wife that afternoon. I stood in a cemetery 2 counties over, on land her family had owned since before the Civil War, and I threw a handful of dirt onto a casket containing the only woman I had ever loved, and I felt something settle in my chest that was not exactly grief, and was not exactly rage, but was some third thing, some cold, clear thing I did not have a name for yet. I did not know, standing at that grave, about the box. I did not know about Charlotte Reyes, or the 17 pages added after a dinner table conversation about probate headaches, or the 20 years of quiet documentation my wife had assembled one careful entry at a time, starting with a cigar box on a folding table in a church fellowship hall. All I knew, standing over that fresh grave with the cold March wind pulling at my coat, was that my son had smiled at his mother's funeral, and that whatever came next, I was not going to spend the rest of my life being quietly folded up and put away the way Vanessa had described it to me, so gently, so reasonably, over a cup of tea I never touched. The will reading was scheduled for the following Thursday, 6 days after the funeral, in Charlotte Reyes's office in a converted brick building downtown that had been a textile mill 100 years earlier, the kind of place where the walls were thick enough that you could not hear anything from the next room, which turned out to matter more than I understood at the time. I want to tell you honestly that I did not go into that room expecting anything unusual. I assumed, the way any grieving husband assumes, that we were about to hear a fairly standard division of assets, the house to me, some savings to Derek, Lily's college fund untouched, the lake property probably left jointly, or left to me outright with instructions to pass it on eventually. I had no idea, sitting in that leather chair with my hands folded in my lap, that I was about to watch my wife reach across the boundary of her own death, and in the space of about 40 minutes, dismantle everything my son and daughter-in-law believed they had already won. Derek and Vanessa arrived 12 minutes late, which even now strikes me as a small, telling detail. A family reeling from loss does not usually manage to be late for something this important with quite that particular breezy confidence. The confidence of people who are not worried because they already believe they know the ending. Vanessa was dressed like she was attending a business meeting, rather than a will reading, a sharp charcoal suit, hair pulled back tight, a leather folio under one arm that I would learn later contained her own set of documents she had brought expecting to need. Derek wore a dark blazer over a gray shirt, no tie, and he shook Charlotte's hand with the easy warmth of a man greeting an old family friend. And then he sat down beside his wife and reached over and squeezed her hand once, briefly, and I watched the corner of his mouth lift again. That same small, satisfied curve I had seen over his mother's casket 6 days earlier. Charlotte Reyes was a small, precise woman in her late 60s, with silver-streaked hair cut close to her jaw and reading glasses she wore, pushed up on her head except for the exact moments she needed them, at which point she would lower them with a small, deliberate motion that I would come to understand over the following 40 minutes was the closest thing to a warning shot that woman ever gave anyone. She had known Maggie for 46 years. She had, I would learn, loved my wife the particular fierce way old college roommates love each other, a loyalty that had outlasted 3 of Charlotte's own marriages and every single one of Maggie's illnesses. She opened a manila folder in front of her, squared its edges against the desk with 2 fingers, the same unconscious precision I use squaring a stone before I set it, and she looked up at the 3 of us, me on one side of the desk, Derek and Vanessa on the other, and she said, "Before I begin, I want everyone in this room to understand that Margaret Hensley left extremely specific instructions about how this reading was to proceed, and I intend to follow every one of them exactly." Vanessa's hand, resting on the leather folio in her lap, went still. Charlotte started with what she called the visible estate, and for the first 10 minutes it went almost exactly as I expected. The house to me, outright, no conditions. Savings and investment accounts split between Derek and myself in proportions that felt fair, generous even, nothing that would have raised an eyebrow in any family in America. A trust for Lily's education, already funded, untouched by anything that happened after. Derek's shoulders, I noticed, relaxed with each item Charlotte read, and beside him Vanessa's hand slowly opened on top of that leather folio, the tension draining out of her fingers, one item at a time, because none of this, not yet, threatened whatever plan she had walked into that room already believing had succeeded. And then Charlotte set down the first folder, squared it against the desk edge, exactly as she had squared the one before it, and reached for a second one, thinner, older, the manila gone soft and slightly yellowed at the corners in the particular way paper yellows after decades in a safe rather than a filing cabinet. The lake property, Charlotte said, 1,140 acres, including all mineral and quarry rights, currently unappraised but conservatively valued, based on comparable regional acreage at approximately $22 million. The room went very quiet. I heard, very distinctly, the tick of a wall clock I had not noticed until that exact moment, an old brass thing mounted above Charlotte's bookshelf, each second landing in the silence like a small stone dropped into still water. Derek's mouth opened slightly. Vanessa's hand closed back around the folio, slowly, deliberately, the way a person closes their hand around something they are afraid might be taken from them. $22 million. I watched my son do the math behind his eyes in real time, watched 20 years of careful, patient family finances suddenly reveal themselves as a false floor over something enormous, and I watched him smile. One more time, the last time I would ever see that particular smile on his face, because whatever came next, whatever Charlotte was about to say, Derek Hensley believed, standing at the edge of that number, that he had already won. The lake property, Charlotte continued, and now she reached up and lowered her reading glasses from the top of her head, settling them onto her nose with that small, deliberate motion I would come to recognize as her warning shot. Is not part of the visible estate I have just finished reading. It was placed 20 years ago into a separate instrument that Margaret asked me to hold unopened until this exact moment. She reached down beside her desk and lifted, with both hands, something I had genuinely forgotten existed until that second, something I had last seen sitting on a high shelf in our bedroom closet, gathering dust for so many years I had stopped seeing it entirely, the way you stop seeing anything that has been in the same place long enough. A small wooden box, maybe 14 inches across, its lid carved with a pattern of interlocking stems and leaves that I recognized instantly, because I had carved it myself, 41 years earlier, as a wedding anniversary gift For a wife who had asked me for exactly one thing that year, something with our initials worked into the border, something that would last. Charlotte set the box on the desk between us, and she said, "Margaret left this with me 20 years ago, on the 4th of December, with instructions that it was to be opened for the first time in this room, in front of both of her heirs, only after her death, and only during the formal reading of her estate. I have honored that instruction for 2 decades without once looking inside it myself." She lifted the small brass latch, and she opened the lid. Derek was still smiling when she did it. "That is the detail I will remember longest, I think, longer than the $22 million, longer than anything that came after in that room, or at the quarry 3 weeks later. My son, sitting across a desk from a box his mother had sealed shut 20 years before he understood what she had seen in him, still smiling, still certain, right up until the exact moment the lid came open, and the first thing inside it caught the afternoon light coming through Charlotte Reyes's window. The first thing inside the box was a letter, and it was not addressed to Derek, and it was not addressed to me. It was addressed, in Maggie's small, upright handwriting, to whoever is reading this now, which turned out to be exactly the kind of instruction my wife would give. Precise enough to matter. Open enough to survive 20 years of not knowing who would actually be sitting in this room when the lid finally came up. Charlotte lifted it out with 2 fingers, the way you lift something that has been waiting a long time to be touched, and beneath it I could see the rest, a second. Thicker stack of envelopes bound with a rubber band gone brittle, pale with age, a cassette tape in a cracked plastic case, with a strip of masking tape across the label, a single photocopied sheet of yellowed ledger paper, and, wrapped in a scrap of felt at the very bottom, a chip of pale gray granite no bigger than a silver dollar, with a series of numbers scratched into its face. Charlotte read the letter aloud, and I will tell you honestly that I had never heard my wife's voice come out of another person's mouth before, and it did something to my chest that no amount of grief counseling in the 11 days since her funeral had managed to do. Charlotte's cadence was not Maggie's cadence, but the words were, every one of them, and somewhere around the 3rd sentence, I stopped hearing Charlotte's reading voice entirely and just heard my wife. "I am writing this on a Tuesday in December 20 years before you are hearing it." Maggie's letter said, "And I do not know yet whether the thing I am afraid of will happen, or whether I am simply an old woman guarding against a shadow that never comes. I have watched something in my son that worries me, not because he is wicked. I do not believe any child of mine is wicked, but because I have watched him learn, slowly, that taking things quietly costs him nothing, and I am afraid of what a man becomes when he learns that lesson too many times before anyone stops him. I am not writing this to punish Derek in advance for something he has not yet done. I am writing this because I love this land more than almost anything on earth besides my husband and my son, and I refuse to let it become a thing that is simply taken, the way smaller things have already, quietly, been taken. Whatever has happened by the time you hear this, know that I loved him completely, and that loving him completely is exactly why I could not let this be easy." Vanessa made a sound at that point, a short, sharp exhale that was not quite a laugh, and she said before Charlotte could go on, I'm sorry, but this is a 20-year-old letter written by a dying woman with, no offense, some pretty serious paranoia about her own son. This isn't a legal instrument, this is a diary entry." Charlotte did not look up from the folder. She simply said, without any heat in her voice at all, "The letter is context, Mrs. Hensley. The trust document underneath it is the legal instrument, and I'll get to that in a moment. I'd ask you to let me finish reading Margaret's words first, since she asked me, specifically, to read them in full before moving to the legal terms." Derek, beside his wife, had gone very still. He was not smiling anymore. I noticed that the moment the tone shifted, the corner of his mouth had simply gone flat, the way a level goes flat when you finally get a wall true. Except this was the opposite of true. This was a man's certainty draining out of his face in real time. Charlotte read the rest of the letter, which was shorter than I expected, and which did not, I want to be clear, name any specific plot or predict any specific scheme, because that was never how Maggie thought and it was not how she wrote. She did not know, 20 years ago, that her daughter-in-law would one day lean over her casket and whisper about being forgotten by Christmas. She could not have known that. What she wrote instead was more general, and somehow more devastating for being general. A mother's plain, worried hope that money would never be allowed to become the thing that decided how her family loved each other, and a mother's clear-eyed acknowledgement that hope alone had never once been enough to guarantee an outcome, not with anyone, not in any family. Which is why she had also, quietly, built something with teeth. That something with teeth was the second document in the folder, and Charlotte moved to it without ceremony, the way you move from a eulogy to a burial, both necessary, neither one able to stand in for the other. 20 years ago, on the same December afternoon she wrote that letter, Margaret Hensley had placed the entire 1,140 acres of lake property, including all quarry and mineral rights, into an irrevocable land conservation trust, jointly held with a regional historic and geological preservation society that permanently barred the land from subdivision, from commercial development, from timber harvest, and this was the sentence that Charlotte read slowly, deliberately, and then read again a second time to make sure it landed, from ever being pledged, mortgaged, or used as collateral for any loan by any party under any circumstance for as long as the trust existed, which under its own terms was in perpetuity. I held a life estate, meaning I could live on it, walk it, be buried on it eventually beside my wife, exactly as we had always planned. But the land itself, the $22 million of granite and lakefront and quarry rights that my son had done the math on not 10 minutes earlier with a smile still fresh on his face, had never, for 20 years, actually been available to inherit in the way either of us assumed. That's not possible, Derek said. His voice had gone thin. Mom couldn't have done that without telling me, without telling anyone. That's insane. That land has been in the family for 4 generations. She wouldn't just lock it away. She didn't lock it away, Derek, Charlotte said. And for the first time I heard something soften in her voice, something that was not quite pity, but was standing very close to it. She protected it. There's a difference, and I think if you sit with this for a while, you'll understand which one she believed she was doing. Vanessa had gone very quiet beside him, and I watched her do the thing I had watched her do at that Christmas dinner years earlier, when Maggie had smiled and said she'd have her attorney look into it. I watched her recalculate, fast, silent, the muscles around her jaw, working even as the rest of her face tried to hold still. There was a remainder clause, Charlotte explained, and this was the part that mattered most for what happened next, though none of us understood that yet. Upon my death, mine, Walter's, whenever that eventually came, the trust's oversight and the associated stewardship fund, some $4 million set aside separately for the land's ongoing maintenance and public access, would pass to Derek, in full provided certain conditions were met. The conditions were not complicated. No attempt to contest, alter, or circumvent the trust, no attempt to use it, or any fraudulent representation of ownership over it, as collateral for personal debt, no act of financial or emotional coercion against either surviving parent. If any of those conditions were violated, the entire remainder, stewardship fund included, would be redirected permanently and without further appeal to a scholarship endowment Maggie had specified by name, the Hensley Trades Foundation, established to fund apprenticeships for young people from difficult homes who wanted to learn a skilled trade the way I had once learned mine, with nothing but a willingness to work and someone patient enough to teach them. I want to stop here and tell you about the ledger page because it is small, and because Charlotte almost read past it too quickly, and because it turned out to matter more than the letter, more than the $22 million, more almost than anything else in that room. It was a single photocopied sheet from an old church treasurer's record book, dated the Sunday after Thanksgiving, 33 years earlier, showing a collection total for the Meyer Family Fire Relief Fund that came up $80 short of what the ushers had counted going in. Underneath, in a different hand, someone, I would learn later, it was the church secretary, a woman who had died some years back, God rest her, had written a small note. W. Hensley confirms discrepancy, declines to name a cause. I felt something go cold in my chest reading that, because I remembered that Sunday with a clarity I had spent 33 years trying to dull, and I had never told a living soul except Maggie what I had seen at that folding table, and Maggie had apparently, quietly, walked into that church office sometime in the following days and asked to see the ledger herself, and had it copied and kept it for 33 years, not to punish our son with it, but to remember precisely exactly what she had seen the beginning of. Derek stared at that page for a long moment. I watched something move behind his eyes that I had genuinely never seen there before, not shame exactly, something closer to recognition, the look of a man being shown a photograph of himself from an angle he has spent his whole life making sure he never had to look at. He did not deny it. That surprised me more than almost anything else that happened in that office. He just looked at the page and then looked at me, briefly, and something passed between us that was not forgiveness and was not accusation either, just two men acknowledging, for the first time in 3 decades, that a specific true thing had actually happened. Vanessa recovered faster than her husband did. She always did. She set her leather folio on Charlotte's desk with a small, decisive click and said, "I appreciate the sentimental journey, but none of this changes the fact that we have documentation of our own." She opened the folio and slid a single sheet across the desk, a photocopy of a signature page, dated 11 days before Maggie died, purporting to be an amendment naming Derek as sole successor trustee of all Hensley family real property holdings, notarized by a name I did not recognize, witnessed by a name I also did not recognize. Charlotte looked at it for exactly 4 seconds. Then she looked up, and her voice, when it came, was quieter than it had been all afternoon, which somehow made it more frightening than if she had shouted. Margaret was on continuous morphine drip by that date, on hospice orders, and had been declared by her own treating physician no longer competent to execute new legal instruments 6 days prior to the date on this page. I have the medical records. I'd strongly encourage you to have your own attorney review the timeline before you rely on this document anywhere outside this room. Vanessa's face did not move, but her hand, resting on the desk beside the folio, closed slowly into a fist, and I understood, watching it, that this had not been an improvised, desperate act. This had been a plan, prepared in advance, walked into that room fully expecting to be needed. I need to tell you something now about myself, because I have been telling you about my son and my daughter-in-law for a while, and it would be dishonest to let you keep believing I sat through all of this as some kind of stone-faced, unbreakable old man. I am not that. There is a hymn Maggie loved, one her own mother used to sing over the stove when Maggie was a girl, and it had played, quietly, from a small speaker at the back of the chapel during her funeral, and I had not heard it since, not once in the 11 days between the funeral and that will reading, because I had gone out of my way, without fully admitting to myself that I was doing it, to avoid any room where it might play. 2 days after the reading, at a barbecue Vanessa's sister organized with what I believe was genuine, if badly timed, good intention, an attempt to get the whole extended family back together, and moving forward, someone's phone, propped in a speaker dock on the porch rail, cycled through a playlist, and that hymn came on, 4 bars of it, before whoever was in charge of the music fumbled to skip it. I did not make a sound. I did not say a word to anyone. I simply set down the plate of food in my hand, hard enough that a few people looked over, and walked out past the garage and stood alone by the fence line for almost 10 minutes, with my hand pressed flat against a post. And I could not, for the length of those 10 minutes, have told you my own name if you had asked me. That is the truth about me. I was not some unbreakable old man doing calm math in a leather chair. I was a man who could be dropped to his knees by 4 bars of a song, and I want that on the record here, because everything I did after that, every careful thing, I did while carrying that exact weakness the whole way through. Not instead of it, it was at that same barbecue, maybe 20 minutes after I came back from the fence line, that Vanessa's young nephew, her sister's boy, 6 years old, missing his 2 front teeth, entirely uninterested in the tension humming under every adult conversation around him, tugged on my sleeve while I was standing by the drink cooler and asked me, with the flat, devastating directness only a 6-year-old can manage, why Aunt Vanessa kept talking about money when everyone said Grandma Maggie died. I did not have a good answer for him. I still do not entirely. But I remember crouching down to his eye level and telling him that sometimes, when people are sad, they get confused about which things actually matter, and that it was a good thing, a very good thing, that he already knew the difference, and that I hoped he never had to learn it the hard way, the way some grown-ups still were. He nodded like that made perfect sense to him, because to a 6-year-old, it did, and then he ran off toward the sprinkler, and I stood there by that cooler feeling, like a boy half his age had just said something to me that not one adult in that entire yard had managed to say all afternoon. Derek and Vanessa left the barbecue early. I did not think much of it at the time. Grief makes people leave early, makes people uncomfortable in crowds, and I told myself that was all it was. It was not all it was. 3 days later, Charlotte called me at the house, her voice tighter than I had ever heard it, and told me that a man named Frank Delgado had walked into her office that morning, unannounced, and asked to speak with her privately for 20 minutes. Frank had worked commercial lending alongside Derek for 11 years at the regional bank, had been at Derek and Vanessa's wedding, had, as far as anyone in that building knew, no reason on earth to walk into a stranger's law office and hand over a folder of paperwork. But he had a conscience, apparently, one that had been working on him for about a week, ever since Derek had called him, not through the bank, off the books, on a Saturday, and asked him, as a favor between old colleagues, whether he knew any private lenders who moved fast, didn't ask too many questions, and would accept undeveloped rural acreage as collateral without waiting on a formal title search. Frank had given him 3 names, out of loyalty, before he'd had time to think it through properly. And then he had gone home that night and thought about it properly, and Monday morning he had quietly pulled the preliminary paperwork Derek had asked him to help review, an appraisal, a survey, a loan application already drafted for $4.5 million against, in black and white, unambiguous language, 1,140 acres on the lake, the same land I now understood. Sitting in Charlotte's office listening to all this on the phone, with my free hand pressed flat against my own kitchen table, had never for one single day in the last 20 years actually been available to pledge as anything. The survey attached to the loan application, Frank told Charlotte, made no mention of any conservation trust, any preservation society, any restriction of any kind. It listed the parcel as free and clear, Derek Hensley as sole beneficial owner, pending settlement of his mother's estate, and it bore, in the corner where a licensed surveyor's stamp should have gone, the seal of a man named Roy Kessler, a semi-retired county surveyor 2 towns over who had, as it happened, also notarized the fraudulent trustee amendment Vanessa had slid across Charlotte's desk 11 days into a will, reading her mother-in-law, had spent 20 years preparing to survive. I sat in my kitchen that evening, with the phone still warm in my hand, long after Charlotte had said goodbye, and I looked out the window at the workshop where I had spent 42 years learning that stone does not lie to you, and I thought about the granite chip wrapped in felt at the bottom of that wooden box, the one with numbers scratched into its face that none of us had asked about yet, because the letter and the ledger and the loan paperwork had taken up all the air in that room. I had carved those numbers myself, 31 years earlier, into the cornerstone of a survey marker. Maggie's grandfather had asked me to set at the northeast boundary of the lake property, back when I was still a young man being tested by an old one, to see whether he trusted his granddaughter's choice of husband. I knew exactly what that stone said, and exactly where it sat, half buried now under decades of pine needles at the true corner of the property line. And I understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after 11 days of grief and fear and small quiet humiliations, that whatever survey Roy Kessler had stamped for that loan application, it could not possibly match the one stone on that entire 1,100 acres that I had set myself by hand with my own 2 eyes on the transit, 31 years before anyone in that room had thought to lie about where the boundary actually stood. Charlotte and I made a decision that night, sitting at my kitchen table with the granite chip from the box between us on a folded paper towel, that we would not do the obvious thing. I could have called the sheriff that same evening. I could have had Charlotte file an injunction the next morning and freeze the loan application before it ever left Roy Kessler's fraudulent survey. Part of me wanted exactly that, wanted it fast and clean and over. But I had spent 42 years learning that you do not rush a foundation. You let the concrete cure. You let a thing set fully before you test whether it will hold weight. Because if you test it too early, all you learn is that it was wet. You never find out whether it would have failed anyway, on its own, under its own weight, once it had every chance to prove itself sound. If we stop them now, I told Charlotte, they'll say it was a mistake, a misunderstanding. Derek's lawyer will call it an innocent enster on a preliminary document, and maybe a judge believes that. And maybe 6 months from now, we're sitting in a courtroom arguing about intent instead of standing in a room full of witnesses, watching the whole thing collapse under its own weight. Charlotte studied me for a long moment across that kitchen table, and something in her face reminded me, so sharply it nearly took my breath, of the way Maggie used to look at me right before she agreed to something she wasn't entirely sure was wise. Margaret used to say you were the most patient man she ever met, Charlotte said finally. I always thought that was about the stonework. I'm starting to think it was about something else. Then she reached across the table, without any particular ceremony, and took my hand in both of hers. And I felt something in my chest give way that I had been holding rigid since the funeral. Some tension I had not even fully known I was carrying until it finally let go. Charlotte Reyes was not a woman given to displays of feeling. I had known her exactly one afternoon and already understood that about her, and I was not, God knows, a man given to them either. But we sat there in my kitchen for a long moment, her hands around mine, neither of us saying anything, two careful, reticent people who had both loved the same woman fiercely enough that grief had briefly worn down the walls each of us usually kept up, and it was, strange as it sounds, the first moment since Maggie died that I felt something other than entirely alone. Over the following 3 weeks, the pieces moved roughly the way Charlotte and I had guessed they would, though not without a few turns that surprised even her. Frank Delgado's conscience, once triggered, apparently could not be put back to sleep. He voluntarily gave a signed statement to the county district attorney's financial crimes unit, laying out, in careful, dated detail, exactly how Derek had approached him and exactly which private lenders he had named. That statement, combined with the mortgage application Frank had copied before quietly handing the originals back, gave the DA's office more than enough to open a formal file without anyone ever needing to touch a bank record they had no right to touch, without any hacking, without any of the shortcuts a lesser story might have needed. Roy Kessler, the surveyor, turned out to be an easier thread to pull than anyone expected. A state licensing board inquiry, triggered by an anonymous complaint about the notarization irregularities on the trustee amendment, found that he had let his actual surveying license lapse 11 months earlier and had been signing documents under it anyway, a separate and entirely unrelated act of fraud that had nothing to do with our family, and everything to do with the fact that men who are willing to lie for one person are usually already lying to several others. The private lender, once its own compliance department got wind, through channels Charlotte set in motion with a single carefully worded letter, nothing more dramatic than that the collateral behind a $4.5 million application sat inside a permanent conservation trust, with an explicit clause barring its use as security for any debt, froze the loan within 4 days. But by then, Derek and Vanessa had already done what people in their position always seem to do, the thing that made the whole scheme finally visible to anyone paying attention. Confident the money was as good as approved, they had gone ahead and hired a construction survey crew and a small development consulting firm to begin preliminary groundwork on the northeast shoreline. Vanessa's idea, Charlotte later learned, a plan to show the lender demonstrated commitment to the project by breaking ground before the funds even cleared, the kind of aggressive move that impresses investors and terrifies anyone who actually understands land law. They scheduled it for a Saturday morning, 3 weeks and 2 days after the will reading, on a stretch of shoreline about 400 yards from the exact spot where I had set that boundary marker 31 years earlier, with Maggie's grandfather standing over my shoulder, testing whether he could trust me. I was there before any of them arrived. I had driven out before dawn, alone, in the same truck I had been driving for 11 years, and I sat on the tailgate in the cold gray light with a thermos of coffee and watched the sun come up over water, so still it looked like a held breath. I thought about Maggie's grandfather teaching her the names of rocks on that same shoreline 60 years earlier. I thought about the 6-year-old boy at the barbecue asking me why his aunt kept talking about money when everyone said Grandma Maggie died. I thought, mostly, about the letter in that box, about a woman writing in the dark 20 years before anyone needed to hear it, hoping she was wrong, building the thing anyway in case she wasn't. By 7:30, the first vehicles started coming up the gravel access road, and I did not feel the cold anymore. Derek and Vanessa arrived in a black SUV, followed by a survey crew truck, a flatbed carrying a small excavator, and 2 more vehicles I did not recognize until they parked. A sleek gray sedan that turned out to belong to the private lender's regional director, a man named Preston Whale, who I would come to understand, before that morning was finished, had been playing a longer and considerably more selfish game than either Derek or Vanessa ever suspected, and a second car belonging to 2 junior investors from a hospitality group Vanessa had apparently been courting independently, without, I would also learn, fully looping her own husband in on every detail of those conversations. Vanessa stepped out first in tall boots and a fitted jacket entirely wrong for a construction site, unrolling a set of site plans across the hood of the SUV with the same brisk confidence I remembered from the will reading, gesturing toward the shoreline where, she was telling the investors cheerfully, a boutique lakefront lodge would eventually stand. Derek trailed a few steps behind her, on his phone, and I noticed, because I had learned, over 3 weeks, to notice everything about my son's posture the way I once noticed the grain in a stone before deciding where to strike it, that he kept glancing toward Preston Whale's sedan with an expression that was not quite suspicion, but was standing very close to it, the look of a man who has started to feel, without yet being able to name why, that he is no longer entirely inside his own plan. It was Vanessa who saw me first. She was mid-gesture, pointing toward the water, laughing at something one of the investors had said, and her hand simply stopped in the air. The laugh died in her throat. I watched her go very still, the way people go still when the ground under a plan they've been standing on turns out not to be there anymore. And then Derek turned to follow her line of sight, and I watched every trace of that survey page smile drain out of his face in real time, replaced by something closer to the look he'd had staring at the $80 shortfall in that church ledger. Recognition, and underneath it, for the first time in 3 weeks, something that looked almost like fear. I did not stand up right away. I let them cross the whole distance from the SUV to where I sat on that tailgate. Let the silence stretch long enough that even the survey crew, unloading equipment from the flatbed, slowed down and looked over, sensing something in the air they couldn't name. Vanessa recovered first, as she always did. "This is private land under active development, Walter," she said, her voice pitched for the investors behind her as much as for me, bright and reasonable. "You really shouldn't be out here without—" "It's my land," I said. I did not raise my voice. I had learned, over 3 weeks of sitting with Charlotte going over exactly what could and could not be said in front of witnesses, exactly what needed to wait for the right room and the right officials, that the quietest sentence in a silent morning carries further than any shout, has been for 20 years, actually, protected exactly the way it's been protected, since before either of you were engaged. You might want to ask Mr. Whale there whether he's seen the trust filing before you finish unrolling that survey. Preston Whale, to his credit or maybe just his instinct for self-preservation, did not wait to be asked twice. He had, it turned out, already begun quietly hedging his own position the moment his compliance department flagged the trust filing 4 days earlier. He had simply not bothered to tell Derek or Vanessa, because the version of the plan Preston Whale had actually been running, the one nobody in that family understood until Charlotte laid it out for them, later that same week, was never really about lending Derek Hensley $4.5 million at all. It was about using the loan application and the fraudulent survey behind it as leverage to acquire development rights to lakefront acreage cheap through foreclosure the moment the whole thing inevitably came apart. A plan that required Derek to fail, not succeed, and that had never once required Preston Whale to actually care whether Vanessa's marriage or her family survived the process. I found out, weeks later, through channels I won't pretend I'm proud of being curious about, that Vanessa had been meeting Preston Whale for drinks, alone, on 4 separate occasions in the 2 months before that Saturday morning, and that whatever she believed those meetings were building toward for the two of them personally, it was not what actually happened, which was Preston Whale climbing back into his sedan 40 minutes later and driving away without a backward glance, leaving Vanessa standing on a gravel shoreline in boots wrong for the terrain, having just watched the man she had been quietly, foolishly counting on abandon her the instant the wind changed, exactly the way she had once counted on being able to abandon me. The county land use officer arrived a few minutes after that, a soft-spoken man named Douglas Frey, who Charlotte had contacted through entirely proper, entirely public channels, a formal complaint filed on the record regarding unpermitted construction activity on protected trust land, and behind him, unannounced, unrequested by anyone, came 4 more trucks I recognized before I recognized their drivers. Men I had trained. A woman named Priya who had apprenticed under me for 3 years in the late 90s and now ran her own stonework crew 2 towns over. Old Bill Ferris, who I had not seen in person in almost a decade, walking with a cane now, but walking all the same because somebody, I never did find out exactly who, had made a few phone calls in the days before that Saturday, quietly. The way word moves through a trade where everyone still remembers who taught them their first true cut, and had simply said that Walter Hensley might need some people standing behind him on Saturday morning. Nobody had asked them to come. Nobody had told them what to say or do once they arrived. They simply parked along the gravel road, got out and stood, a dozen of them eventually, arms crossed against the morning chill, saying almost nothing, and their silence, I have to tell you, said more to that shoreline than any speech I could have given. Lily arrived last, in the back seat of a car driven by Vanessa's sister, who had brought her along thinking it was still going to be a groundbreaking celebration, a family event, something to photograph. Lily was 12, and she got out of that car into a scene that made no sense to her at all. Her father pale and silent, her mother arguing in a low, furious voice with a county official, her grandfather standing calm and unmoving at the center of it, surrounded by strangers who all somehow seemed to know each other. She looked at all of it for a moment, the way children do, taking the emotional temperature of a room faster than any adult manages, and then she walked straight past her mother, past the surveyors, past Douglas Frey with his clipboard, and she put her arms around me, right there in front of everyone, and she said, loud enough that half the shoreline heard it, Grandma Maggie loved this place more than anything, and I don't care what anyone says, Grandpa didn't do anything wrong. Vanessa turned toward her daughter, started to say something, I do not know what, some version, probably, of Lily. Not now, and Lily cut her off, 12 years old, chin up, in front of investors and surveyors and county officials, and a dozen silent stonemasons, and said, No, I heard you on the phone last week. I know what you were trying to do. I felt my throat close up in a way it had not since the funeral, and I held on to my granddaughter on that shoreline for what felt like a very long time, and somewhere behind me I heard old Bill Ferris clear his throat, loud and deliberate, the sound a man makes when he does not trust his own voice not to break. Derek did not say anything for a long time. I watched him standing apart from all of it, from his wife's collapsing arrangement with Preston Whale, from his daughter's fury, from Douglas Frey, quietly informing everyone present that all equipment on site would need to be removed by end of day, pending a formal cease and desist order, from the 12 silent men and women standing along the gravel road who had once been my apprentices. And then he walked toward me, alone, past all of it, and stood there for a moment with his hands loose at his sides. looking not at the water or the survey stakes or his wife, but at me directly the way he had not looked at me in longer than I could easily remember. "I emptied that collection box," he said. His voice was quiet, rough, nothing like the boardroom voice I'd heard him use for a decade. 33 years ago, I've never told anyone that. Mom never said a word to me about it, not once, my whole life. I actually thought I got away with it. I looked at my son for a long moment, and I thought about the ledger page, and the boy at the folding table, and the cigar box wrapped in construction paper by children who had no idea what it would come to mean, and I thought about the promise I'd made myself sitting in that kitchen with Charlotte 3 weeks earlier, that whatever else happened, I was going to tell the truth even when it cost me something. "You didn't get away with it," I said. "Your mother just decided to wait 33 years to collect. And I should have told you myself, the day it happened, instead of leaving it to a dying woman and a photocopied ledger page to finally say the thing I was too much of a coward to say to my own son's face. That's on me too, Derek. I've had a long time to sit with that." He did not say anything back, but something in his shoulders came down, an inch, maybe less, the particular unclenching of a man hearing, for the first time in a long while, that he is not the only person in the conversation carrying something they got wrong. That was, I want to be clear, the beginning of something with my son, and not the end of it, and I am not going to stand here and tell you it resolved into a clean reconciliation on a gravel shoreline in front of witnesses, because that is not how real families work, and Maggie, of all people, would never have wanted me to pretend otherwise. But it was something. It was more than the smile I'd watched him wear over his mother's casket 3 weeks earlier, and on a morning that had started with fraud and ended with federal financial crimes investigators taking statements from a private lender's regional director, while my granddaughter stood between her parents, refusing to look away. Something was, I think, the most anyone in that family had a right to expect. The weeks that followed unfolded exactly the way 20 years of careful preparation tend to unfold once the last piece finally falls, which is to say quietly, on paper, in offices, largely without drama, the drama having already spent itself entirely on that gravel shoreline. Roy Kessler lost his suspended license permanently and was charged with fraud in connection with 2 other unrelated survey jobs. The licensing board's inquiry had turned up. Once they started looking closely at his file, a reminder Charlotte offered me gently that the people willing to lie for one client are rarely lying for only one. Preston Wales' firm quietly settled with the county over the unpermitted groundwork, paid a fine that amounted to less than a rounding error against his firm's annual revenue, and Preston Wale himself was reassigned, according to a brief item in a regional business paper, to a different territory entirely, the kind of soft, bloodless consequence men like that usually receive, which did not sit easily with me, but which I have made a kind of peace with, because I never set out to fix the whole world's arithmetic, only my own family's. The district attorney's office, working from Frank Delgado's voluntary statement and the loan documents he had copied through entirely proper channels, filed formal fraud charges against Derek in connection with the falsified survey and the misrepresented loan application, not the trustee amendment itself, which turned out to be Vanessa's doing far more than his, a distinction the investigators sorted out through forensic handwriting analysis on documents that had been sitting in a folio the whole time, evidence nobody had needed to hack or steal, only ask the right questions about. Derek's attorney negotiated a plea to a reduced charge, avoiding prison in exchange for restitution, 5 years of probation, and the loss of every professional license that had ever let him work in banking or finance, which meant, in plain terms, that the vice president title he had spent 12 years building evaporated in the space of one signature on a plea agreement. He is working now, I am told, as a shift supervisor at a lumber distribution yard 2 towns over, a job old Bill Ferris, of all people, quietly helped him get, because Bill said something to me once that I have turned over in my mind many times since, that a man who has just watched everything he built on lies collapse sometimes needs, more than punishment, somebody willing to hand him an honest day's work and let him rebuild something true from the bottom up, the way stone is built, one course at a time, nothing skipped. Vanessa's charges were more serious, and less softened by anyone's mercy, because forensic examiners found her fingerprints, literally and figuratively, all over the fabricated trustee amendment in a way Derek's never quite were. She was charged separately, convicted of forgery and attempted fraud, and served 14 months before her release on parole. Derek filed for divorce 4 months after the shoreline, not because of the criminal case. He told me once, quietly, over coffee at my kitchen table, the first time he had sat at that table since Maggie's funeral, but because somewhere in the space between Preston Wales' sedan pulling away and his daughter refusing to look away from him on that gravel road, he had finally understood, with a clarity he said had taken him 30 years to earn, that he had spent his marriage letting his wife's hunger stand in for his own missing courage, and that he could not build anything honest with anyone until he stopped doing that. Lily lives with him now most of the time in a small rented house not far from the lumber yard, and she comes out to the workshop most Saturdays, and I have started, slowly, carefully, teaching her the things I once taught her father, and there is a version of this story I have come to believe where that particular repair, one granddaughter, one workshop, one patient old man with nothing left to prove, turns out to matter more in the end than any of the $22 million ever did. I did not keep the stewardship fund. I want to be honest about that too, because Maggie's trust had left the door open for it to pass to Derek eventually, if he met her conditions, and for a long while, in the raw months right after the shoreline, I told myself that door was closed for good, that he had forfeited it the moment Roy Kessler's fraudulent survey went out under his name. But sitting with Charlotte a year later, going over the paperwork on what would become the Hensley Trades Foundation, I found myself thinking about a 19-year-old boy at a folding table and a 9-year-old boy on a shoreline crouched by a sprinkler, asking me a question I still did not have a full answer for, and I made a decision Maggie herself might not have made, though I like to believe she would have understood it. I redirected the foundation's charter to fund not just outside apprentices, but a standing scholarship in Derek's own name, contingent on nothing except 5 years of demonstrated honest work, reviewed by Charlotte and by me together each year, not forgiveness handed over freely, because I do not believe forgiveness works that way, but a door left open, the kind Maggie herself had built into every hard thing she ever did, teeth and mercy in the same document, because that, I came to understand, reading her letter over and over in the year since, was the whole of what my wife had actually been trying to teach all of us the entire time. I still go out to the lake most mornings. The trust holds, exactly as Maggie built it, untouchable. The water still clean enough in August to see your own boots on the bottom. The quarry rights still sitting silent and protected under 1,100 acres. Nobody will ever be allowed to tear open for a lodge or a subdivision or anyone's second chance at easy money. I built a small stone marker at the northeast corner 2 summers ago, right beside the original boundary stone I set 31 years earlier, and I carved into it not a date or a name, but a single line, the closest thing to a eulogy I ever managed for my wife. She built what love could not always guarantee on its own. I sit out there some mornings with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, and I think about a cassette tape still sitting in Charlotte's office that I have never once been able to bring myself to play, my wife's own voice recorded 20 years ago for a version of this moment she hoped, more than anything, would never actually arrive. And I think that maybe someday I will be ready to hear it, and maybe I never will be. And either way, I think Maggie would understand that too, the way she seemed, in the end, to understand almost everything about the people she loved, long before any of us understood it about ourselves.